and Waiver Wire podcast for week 13. I'm your host, Josh Shepardson, and you can follow me on Twitter where I post is at bchad50. And let's jump right into things where this week I've got a couple more running backs that are worth waiver wire ads. First is a guy that we talked about earlier in the season, guy who a lot of gamers drafted with some big expectations of, but hasn't really lived up to those, and that's Amir Abdullah. Abdullah has been getting more work of late, though, and really like his schedule here down the stretch. Over the last 2 weeks, he has played 25 offensive snaps and 28 offensive snaps in back-to-back contests in Week 11 and Week 12. That's according to the Football Guys offensive snap counts. And in those 2 games, he's totaled 28 carries for 107 yards rushing, added 2 receptions for 14 yards. Not huge numbers, but given the state of running back at this time with a number of guys dropping like flies, certainly noteworthy. And he has some favorable matchups, as I said, down the stretch. Faces the Packers in Detroit this week. And while the Packers aren't giving up a ton of fantasy points to running backs, they are ceding 4.2 yards per carry. The offense is not scoring a lot for the Packers now. They're not putting teams away. They're not racing out to big leads like we're accustomed to and forcing teams to play catch-up. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the Lions went into Green Bay and beat the Packers in a low-scoring affair. So I'm not too concerned about game flow getting out of hand this week for Amir Abdullah and the Lions. And as long as they can keep it close, another 12 to 15 carries seems to be within the realm of possibility for Abdullah. He's not the preferred pass-catching back. That's Theo Riddick, but he is a capable pass catcher himself. He has his next matchup is against the Rams in Week 14. Seems like a tough fantasy matchup, and it would have been earlier in the season, but they're actually allowing the 14th most fantasy points per game to running backs according to Pro Football Reference. And then after that, it gets great. Your playoff weeks and your championship week, Week 15 and Week 16, he faces the Saints and 49ers respectively. Those teams are yielding the 4th most fantasy points and 5th most fantasy points to running backs. Also, good news is that they don't face the 49ers in San Francisco, where the Niners are much tougher. They actually get them at home. So looks like a really nice stretch here. And even if you don't need Abdullah this week or next week, if you have some running back issues, you certainly have to be licking your chops at those Week 15 and 16 matchups where he's facing a couple of really, really bad run defenses. Next up is David Johnson, who I don't want to say was a super popular, trendy, buzzy rookie pick at the beginning of the year. Certainly not in the same breath as Amir Abdullah, but did have some buzz going into the year. Showed off some explosive playmaking ability earlier in the year. But Chris Johnson emerged as a really good running back for the Arizona Cardinals, and that was surprising given the way he looked last year. But he's nicked up. He left last week's contest with a knee injury. I've read everything from a bone bruise to a contusion. Still waiting on MRI results. Was reportedly seen with a significant limp on Monday. And I'd say that certainly puts his availability at least this week into question. And depending on the MRI results and how quickly he's able to get that knee working right, could miss multiple contests. Andre Ellington was thrust into the feature role, and shocker, Andre Ellington got hurt. I mean, this is nothing new for Andre Ellington. He just doesn't seem to be built to carry a feature back's role. Not all the injuries are related. It's tough to pin all of them on him. But the guy's just never held up as a feature back. He was never even heavily utilized at Clemson in his college days. He didn't carry the ball a ton. He has a turf toe issue, probably going to miss a few contests. And that's going to thrust David Johnson into a feature role if both guys are out. Johnson's a well-rounded back who can catch the ball out of the backfield, has done well with goal line duty, has been a good return guy, but unless your league counts return yardage, that doesn't really matter. And most likely there's at least a good chance that he'll be pulled off of kick return duty since, I mean, their running backs have dropped like flies. They'd be asking for trouble to try him out and have him do that as well. But obviously that remains to be seen. But point being, he has the skill set to be an every down back. And now that we're a little bit later into the season, I would suspect that Bruce Arians will feel a little bit more comfortable giving him a larger role. Earlier in the season when he was playing well, Arians indicated that he wanted to gradually increase his role throughout the year, not put too much on the rookie's plate. He's done well in what they've asked him to do. I think at this point, probably a safe bet that if both are out, Johnson will be relied on to do a little bit of everything. And certainly good to be tied to the league-leading scoring offense in the NFL. Team is averaging 32.3 points per game. Get him a few goal line touches. Just the team can score, and being tied to that as a feature back is always a plus. Moving on to the streaming options for this week, we got Kirk Cousins at quarterback, coming off of another good game at home. That being the key, he has another home contest this week, this time against the Dallas Cowboys. At home, he's completed 74.75% of his passes at 8.24 yards per attempt, with 11 touchdowns, just 2 interceptions, averaging 272 yards passing per game. He's even rushed for 3 touchdowns. To further illustrate just how much better he's been at home than on the road, he has just a 69.7 QB rating away from Washington and a 121.2 QB rating at home. He's been awesome at home, and he's now facing a Cowboys team that's without Tony Romo, and a Matt Castle-led offense is not likely to score points, likely to be forced to punt it, probably going to put the Redskins in some favorable scoring situations. So even though the Cowboys defense hasn't been surrendering a ton of fantasy points to quarterbacks this year, I like Cousins and the Redskins to end up in some favorable short field situations, putting Cousins in a good spot to score some fantasy points this week. Next up is a deeper league option, but a guy who has some flex appeal if you're injury ravaged in a 12-team league, or maybe you start multiple flexes or have 3 receivers and just have, some crazier starting lineups. And that's Seth Roberts of the Oakland Raiders. The undrafted rookie free agent has really panned out, has good size at 6'2", really fast. He ran a 4.40 reportedly at his 40-yard dash at his pro day. Was not invited to the NFL draft combine, but did certainly light up the stopwatch at his pro day. And he's been a big play waiting to happen this year, averaging 16.8 yards per reception on 21 grabs. Also caught 4 touchdowns, coming off of his best game of the year, in which he caught 6 passes for 113 yards and a pair of touchdowns. David Carr airs it out a lot. Derek Carr airs it out a lot. The Raiders in general air the ball out a ton. Even when he left the season opener early against the Bengals, Matt McGloin came in and threw the ball quite a bit. So certainly air it out enough to get a third fiddle like Seth Roberts some looks, even behind Amari Cooper and Michael Crabtree. And worth noting that Roberts really doesn't need a lot of targets to have value. He is a big play threat, as I exemplified with his yards per catch. But also, he's a guy who's gone for some decent yardage here in recent weeks. 3 of the last 4 contests, he's had at least 54 yards receiving. So certainly getting some big yardage, big chunk plays. And against the league worst fantasy defense defending receivers, Kansas City Chiefs, and by league worst, I mean allowing the most fantasy points to receivers this year, this is a really good matchup for Roberts and all of the Raiders receivers, really. But the one that's available is Seth Roberts, and even with Crabtree and Cooper in front of him, I certainly like Roberts as a strong flex play in 14-team leagues, and at least a viable flex play in 12-team leagues if you're looking for some help. Next up at tight end, Cameron Bate is 0% CBS owned, 0% ESPN owned, and 0% Yahoo owned. If you're wondering who he is, you're not alone. He was an undrafted free agent signing by the Bucs last year, caught just 1 pass in 2014. This year, he has just 14 receptions on 17 targets, but he's quietly emerged lately, and he and Jameis Winston have been on the same page. Over the last 5 weeks, he has caught 3 touchdown passes, including a touchdown grab in back-to-back games. He's bested 45 yards receiving with all of those games. And one of those games was a 2-catch, 48-yard effort with a touchdown grab against the Falcons in Week 8. He's once again facing the Falcons this week, and they're tied for the 10th most fantasy points allowed per game to tight ends. As long as Austin Seferian-Jenkins remains out, and he is still yet to be cleared for contact, looking increasingly like he's going to miss the remainder of the season, or at least the next few weeks, because even after he's cleared for contact, he's still going to have to shake off some rust and build up some strength in that shoulder. But Brate has emerged as a quality tight end, and the added benefit of grabbing him this week in a plus matchup is that you get him for an even better matchup next week in Week 14 against the Saints. The Saints are allowing the most fantasy points per game to tight ends this year. So if you are a Gronk owner and worried that Gronk's going to miss this week, it sounds like it's a knee bruise for him, a bone bruise. Actually, I'm not sure if it's bone bruise. Apologies. Bruised knee that may not even sideline him this week, may just sideline him this week, may sideline him this week and next week. Not a long-term injury, but if you're a Gronk owner, you certainly probably aren't rostering two tight ends unless you hit the wire and grabbed Gary Barnidge early and you start a tight end at flex or something like that. So most likely you are in need of some insurance at tight end in case he doesn't go this week. Brate's a great grab. If you lost Jimmy Graham for the season again, Brate makes for a good grab because he's a guy that you can use both this week and next week. Finally, going to wrap things up with a defense suggestion, and that's the Miami Dolphins. Obviously, if you're depending on when you're watching this, or if you at least check the timestamp on this, you know that the Monday Night Football game hasn't been played yet. That means we don't really know what the Ravens are going to look like with Matt Schaub under center, but we should have a pretty good idea since Schaub looked like a shell of himself last year in the preseason and lost the starting quarterback job to Carr in Oakland. Looked terrible in his last starting gig with the Houston Texans. Really doesn't belong starting NFL games at this point in his career. Pick six waiting to happen. And he's without weapons, too, which makes things even worse for him. No Steve Smith. Dennis Pitt has missed his second season in a row. And Crockett Gilmore and Kamar Aiken just aren't going to cut it for a guy who needs a lot more help than that. Justin Forsett out for the year, so that means Buck Allen is in the backfield. He may play all right. He's going to probably be force-fed the ball, but certainly not an explosive offense, not an offense you worry about. And that means that every defense going forward that plays the Ravens is going to be in play as a starting option. That includes the Miami Dolphins, who were just torched by the New York Jets, but they certainly have some talent on that defense, even though it hasn't played up to expectations this year against a team that just doesn't lack NFL caliber players at many starting caliber players anyway, and multiple offensive positions. You go ahead and roll the dice on a team like the Dolphins if you're in need of defensive help. You don't have a top defense like the Panthers or the Broncos or one of the pretty much must starts every week. Go ahead and roll the dice on the Miami Dolphins. And that's going to wrap things up for this week's podcast. Go ahead and check out fantasyfootballcafe.com for some great articles, podcasts, and our very active fantasy football forums. Until next week, good luck.